Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Our mission, as always, is pretty simple. We take the source material you give us, we jump right in, and we pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts, and connect the dots where we can.
It's all about giving you that shortcut to being well-informed using only what's in the material provided.
Exactly. And today we've got excerpts from a YouTube transcript.
That's right. It features insights from Tulsi Gabbard. The source material actually refers to her as Director of National Intelligence in the context of that specific interview, and also the interviewer, who's just named Will.
Okay. And this source material, it seems to point us in two main directions for this deep dive.
Yeah, two pretty distinct areas. First, we're going to look at what the source says about some declassified documents.
Right, the ones concerning how certain ideologies were apparently linked to potential domestic violent extremism under the Biden administration.
Yeah.
And there's some related surveillance stuff in there, too.
Exactly. And then the second part, we'll kind of switch gears completely. And we'll look at a separate incident, the source details, involving a judge who allegedly helped an illegal immigrant evade ICE custody. Right in a courthouse.
Wow. Okay. So two quite different topics pulled from this one source.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. We'll be your guides, exploring only what this specific source material reveals about these things. We're sticking strictly to the info in the transcript.
And, we really invite you, the listener, to think critically about this information as we unpack it from the source.
Definitely. So where do we start? The declassified document.
Let's start there. The source really focuses on the Biden administration's strategic implementation plan. This plan deals with potential violent domestic extremists.
And the language used in these documents, according to the source, is pretty specific, right?
It is. The source highlights phrases about people who may likely turn out to be or may likely turn to violence. And the reason given is because of specific ideologies they hold.
Ideologies. Okay, and what kind of ideologies are we talking about here, based on the source?
Well, this is where the source draws a really critical connection.
Yeah.
It claims these designated ideologies often belong to people who are, just using their First Amendment rights. They're opposing specific Biden administration policies. That's the link the source makes.
Does the source give examples?
It does. It lays out things like opposition to COVID vaccine mandates, mask mandates, parents who were concerned about kids getting vaccines in schools without their consent, and also opposition to the administration's border policy.
So the source is saying that holding those views.
Yeah.
The document suggested that could mean you have a propensity to join a militia.
Yeah.
Or become a domestic violent extremist.
That's the connection drawn in the source, yes.
Yes.
That holding those opinions could suggest that kind of propensity according to its interpretation of those documents.
The source also brings up this idea of a continuum, right? Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, the source makes a point of explaining this. It's not saying, or at least the source's interpretation isn't, that holding these views automatically makes you an extremist, but rather it places you on a sort of path, a continuum towards potential violent extremism.
And that could lead to what? Being watched.
Potentially. The source suggests maybe monitoring on social media, for instance. It uses this analogy to try and clarify.
An analogy.
Yeah, like all baseball players wear hats, but do all people that wear hats play baseball?
Ah, okay. Trying to show maybe a flawed logic or a broad brush being used.
That seems to be the point the source is making with that analogy, yes. Showing the kind of connection it claims is being made.
And the transcript also mentions former FBI agents.
Right. They're cited in the source as supporting this view, this idea of a continuum that essentially casts suspicion on people who oppose certain government policies.
Okay, so let's connect this to the timeline the source presents. These documents.
Yeah.
They came out when?
December 2021. According to the source.
Right. And then later, the source points to that speech by President Biden, September 2022.
That's the one. The source describes it as ominous, the red background, the Marines.
And in that speech, he warned about Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans being a threat.
A direct threat to the Republic, yeah. That's how the source frames the sequence. Documents first, then this speech.
And there's another layer here the source brings in about social media.
Yes. The source claims that the FBI and others within the Biden administration allegedly directed social media companies to censor Americans.
Censor them.
And
undermine First Amendment rights.
That's the claim in the source. And the reason given, again, in the source for why the social media companies might cooperate was apparently their desire to avoid being seen as supporting the spread of domestic violent extremism.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together from this section. The documents linking opposition ideologies to potential extremism, the timeline, the alleged censorship. What's the main takeaway according to the source?
Well, the source argues that when you look at all this together, what you're seeing is a kind of weaponization
Weaponization.
and politicization of the intelligence community, the national security apparatus, but turned inward against Americans based on their political views or their opposition to certain policies. That's the core argument presented in this part of the source material.
A pretty serious charge being laid out there in the source.
Definitely.
Okay, so that covers the documents and ideologies part. Now, the source shifts focus a bit, right, to the Quiet Skies program.
It does. Described in the transcript as a, quote, secret domestic terror watch list program.
Secret. And the source provides a very personal example here, doesn't it?
Extremely personal.
Right.
Tulsi Gabbard herself states in the transcript that she was put on this Quiet Skies list.
When?
Literally the day after she spoke out publicly against then Vice President Kamala Harris. She was criticizing Harris's policies and warned about her as a potential commander-in-chief.
Wow. Placed on a terror watch list the next day. That's the claim.
That is the claim made in the source, yeah.
And the source brings in Senator Rand Paul's perspective on this.
It does. He's quoted in the transcript saying he believes she was targeted specifically because of her speech, her constitutionally protected speech, and her political positions.
So he's questioning the whole process.
He is, especially, putting a former congresswoman, someone who served at a high level, on a list like that. And he makes the point, if it can happen to her, it shouldn't happen to ordinary citizens either.
Does the source suggest others might be on these lists too?
Yeah, Senator Paul is cited in the transcript as believing there's a long list of others, potentially even other members of Congress.
Members of Congress on a domestic terror watch list.
That's the possibility raised in the source. It even mentions some might have been visited at home.
Visited at home? By whom?
The source doesn't specify who would do the visiting in that context, just raises it as a possibility connected to these lists.
And does Gabbard confirm knowing others on the list?
The source says she confirms hearing from other members of Congress who were on this list while serving, and apparently they remained on it even after they notified the TSA.
There's also an anecdote she shares, right? About a trip.
Yes, a really striking one. She talks about being in Rome at the Vatican for meetings.
Okay.
And she met with other people there, participating in the exact same meeting she was in, but they weren't put on the Quiet Skies list.
Which she was.
She was. Placed on it the night before she traveled, which the source notes was right after she criticized then Vice President Harris on Fox News.
So the timing is highlighted again.
Very much so. And the source adds that the TSA Air Marshal Director apparently tried to justify her placement, but according to the transcript, had no answer for why the others she met with weren't listed.
So, wrapping up this Quiet Sky section, what's the overall point the source is making about this program?
Based on this example and the claims, the source presents Quiet Skies as another tool, another federal program that can be easily weaponized and allegedly has been against people the administration at the time considered a threat. That's the perspective offered in the source.
Okay. Weaponization seems to be a recurring theme from the source's perspective.
It definitely seems to be a central thread the source is pulling on.
All right, let's pivot then to the second major incident detailed in the source material. This one takes us to Milwaukee.
That's right, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. An incident involving a judge, Hannah Deegan, and a man named Eduardo Flores Ruiz, described in the transcript as an illegal immigrant.
Okay, what happened? Set the scene for us based on the source.
So picture the Milwaukee County Courthouse hallway. Judge Dugan approaches two ICE agents who are there.
Okay.
She asks them to go visit the chief judge's office.
I'm just sending them on an errand.
Seems like it. And the source claims that while those two agents were, distracted or occupied by this request, Flores Ruiz and his lawyer stepped out into the hallway, apparently making a break for it.
So the judge created a diversion? Is that what the source implies?
That's certainly the implication based on the sequence described. But then there's a twist.
What's that?
The source highlights there was actually a third ICE agent nearby watching.
Oh. So he wasn't distracted.
Exactly. And this agent immediately started tailing Flores Ruiz and his lawyer as they tried to leave.
Where did they go?
The source says they went down to the basement and then out a door.
Out onto the street.
Out onto the street. And then, according to the source, Flores Ruiz just took off, full sprint.
And the agent?
The agent gave chase for several hundred meters, the source says.
Wow.
And eventually, the agent tackled Flores Ruiz and took him back into custody.
So the escape was ultimately foiled. But the judge, what's her situation now, according to the source?
The source states she's facing charges, obstruction of justice for her alleged role in trying to facilitate that escape.
Okay. And how does Tulsi Gabbard in the source material react to this specific incident?
Well, she connects it back, actually. She sees it as demonstrating a kind of common theme, which she explicitly links in her comments to the previous administration, meaning the Biden administration in this context.
A theme of what?
A theme of people in authority believing they're sort of above the law, that they can break it or undermine the rule of law if they feel justified.
And she calls the judge.
She describes Judge Dugan as an activist judge. Her view, as presented in the source, is that the judge was actively helping someone who had already broken the law by entering the country illegally to evade law enforcement who already had him.
So, two very different situations.
Mhm.
The documents watch lists and this judge incident, but the source seems to be trying to connect them.
Yeah, it tries to bring them together under a broader point near the end.
What's that connection?
The source argues that incidents like the judge's alleged actions happen partly because of a lack of transparency.
Okay.
And that lack of transparency, it claims, leads to a lack of accountability for what the source calls bad actors within our own government.
Bad acts.
That's the term used. And the source claims these individuals get away with crimes or unconstitutional acts, and in doing so, they undermine fundamental rights and freedoms described in the source as God-given rights and freedoms.
So, lack of transparency enables bad actors who undermine rights. That's the argument.
That's the connection the source makes, yeah. And it doesn't stop there. It actually offers a prediction.
A prediction.
About what? It suggests that as more information like this potentially gets declassified or comes out, we shouldn't be surprised to see a, quote, very same playbook used by those being exposed.
What playbook is that?
The source describes it like this. The people who are allegedly doing these things, the bad actors, will turn around and accuse the people exposing them, the whistleblowers or journalists or whoever, of the very same things they themselves are guilty of.
Like a deflection tactic.
Exactly. A deflection tactic potentially amplified, the source suggests, by their friends in the legacy and mainstream propaganda media. That's the language used in the source.
Propaganda media. Strong words there.
Very strong language used in the source material, yes.
Okay, so as we wrap up, the source is essentially asking us, the listeners, to think about what all this means, right?
Yeah, it's prompting reflection. Based purely on what's presented in this source, what does it suggest about how information gets gathered and maybe used or potentially misused within government?
How power might be abused.
Potentially, yeah. And maybe the importance of questioning assumptions, questioning official narratives. That seems to be an underlying suggestion.
How might understanding these events, again, as presented by this source, impact how you view current events or government actions?
It's food for thought, definitely, based strictly on the claims and narratives within this specific transcript.
So just to quickly recap, we've journeyed through this source material.
Yep.
Looking at the link it draws between certain opinions and potential extremism, the claims about the Quiet Skies program and its alleged weaponization, using that specific Gabbard example.
And then that detailed incident in Milwaukee with the judge allegedly facilitating an escape attempt.
And we have to stress again, this entire deep dive, everything we've discussed, comes directly and solely from the content of that provided YouTube video transcript.
No outside info, no personal opinions, just unpacking what the source itself laid out.
Exactly. So here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over, drawing from the themes we've touched on today based on the source.
Okay.
What does it really mean for a society when different groups inside it seem to operate with fundamentally different definitions of critical terms? Terms like extremist or even the rule of law.
Yeah. When the same words mean different things to different people.
Right. And what role does access to information and, maybe more importantly, the presentation of that information play in shaping those very different, often deeply held viewpoints?
That's a deep question to end on. Definitely something to think about.